Hi, welcome to Seaside Quilting Tutorials. My name is Terry, and today it's time for block 8 of our sampler quilt. And today we're going to be doing the economy block, which is going to give us some practice in cutting triangles for it and also squaring them up in the block so that it comes out looking really nice. So basically, the economy block, I had always called it a square and a square and a square, because that's pretty much what it is. And then I found out that the actual name of it is economy. And it's a wonderful block because it can be used to make an entire quilt, which pretty much all of the blocks that we have been doing for our sampler quilt are handy in that way. And when put together side by side, they create a design within a design, which is really nice. And they can also be mixed and matched or made in a smaller form so that we can use them for cornerstones in a quilt, or we can use them to create borders. So the techniques that we're learning are really helpful, and I'm hoping that you're enjoying our tutorials. So let's go ahead and get started with that. So today we're going to start at the cutting table because we're going to be cutting these out a little bit differently than we normally do, because typically we've been cutting out squares and triangles. Squares and rectangles for our blocks. So these that we're cutting out today are going to be cut out a little bit differently and a little bit larger than we typically have been cutting them out, because we've been cutting out 4.5 inches, 5 inches, and so forth, and 2.5 and whatnot to make up our 12.5 unfinished blocks. So our first block is going to be, or rather our first square is going to be 6.5 by 6.5. And this is going to be in our block, our center focus of our block. So whatever you choose something that you want in the center, and we're going to accent it with the pieces that go around your center. I hope you're getting a good view of that. This is for my sampler quilt, I've been using the Home to Roost, created by Susan Wingett, for the Wilmington Prints Company. I've fallen in love with this fabric. Of course, I love blues, so working with this fabric really makes me happy. So your first one, your center focus, you're going to cut out your 6.5 by 6.5 square. Now, often the problem that we run into when we need to cut out a larger square or rectangle or whatever, we typically are using our 6 by 24.5, or some might be using a 6 by 12.5, which is totally fine. But the problem is when you need to cut something out larger, what do? And we're always telling you that once you pick a ruler to do your cutting, stay with that ruler, because the print of every ruler is different. So your measurements could be just a little bit off in your block if you switch between rulers. I never use my mat for measuring out my cutting of blocks. It's just that, you know, if you need to cut something 6 7/8 or 6 3/8 or in quarters, it's harder to measure on your mat, for one thing. Mat measurements are never quite the same as your measurements on your rulers. So basically, when I use measurements on my mat, it's if I'm separating some fabric, like say I know that I need a quilt that's going to need 3 yards of this and 4 yards of that, I'll separate that fabric out so that I have it packed together and know that that's what I'm using for that entire quilt. Also, what I use my mat for is to get a straight edge on my fabric. So one of the things that I just wanted to point out today is that when I cut, you have your fabric, when you get it, you have it from the fold to the selvage. And then you can cut it just like this and get your straight edge on the side, and you can cut it the long way. Just making sure that you're moving, you know, that you're stopping with your rotary cutter and moving your hand up your ruler so that you're keeping your ruler steady, or using a hand weight on the end of your ruler to keep it from shifting. However, typically how I cut mine, and I'm hoping that you can see this, even though I've straightened this edge before when I've made cuts, when I go to cut this again, because it's been folded up and set aside, I've lost my straight edge. Now I could adjust this and try to get it, you know, set up with my cut before, but then it might be just a little bit off. And we don't want that. We want a nice straight edge when we start out. So to achieve that, what I do is I take my fold from my fold and I'll fold it again up to my selvage. Now there's a reason why I'm going back over this, even though I've done a cutting tutorial previously, because I'm going to show you a different ruler today. So when you fold it again, see how this is kind of like a half circle. It's not flat. You want to make sure that you flatten this out a little bit. Just finger press it and make sure that you don't have a fold within your fold. So I'll open it up after I finger pressed it. I double check it to make sure I don't have any puckering going on in there, because if you did, when you fold it in half again, what will happen is you'll have an uneven cut on your end. And you'll notice that after you've done your strip cut, that this side might have like a little, it might be a little wider than it is down here. So you want to finger press this, and you want to make sure that you're getting a nice fold there, because we're going to use that fold line and we're going to line it up on our mat on a line. So I'm using the fold that I've created, and you want to make sure that this is folded well so that you have your fold up against your selvage. Your selvage is the straightest part of your fabric. So now that I've double checked that and made sure that I have it folded properly, I'm just finger pressing it a little bit, and then I'm going to line that up onto one of my lines, and I'm going to have it go just a little bit past. Now I don't have a lot to even out. Sometimes when you get fabric, Seaside Quilting Supplies does a wonderful job of sending us fabrics that are cut pretty even on the ends. Unless it's an end of bolt product or something like that, which isn't anything to do with them. It will be the way that the company has folded it at the end. Their cuts are pretty darn nice. I can never complain, and they've always sent me, if I order a yard, I always get just a little more than a yard. They don't cut on the exact yard line, which is nice for us, because if it is off a little bit on one side or the other, we're not losing any fabric that we've purchased. And I love that about Seaside Quilting Supplies. It's one of the things that when I first found them and I got my first couple of orders, I was so amazed at how well they cut their fabric for us and how thoughtful they are in their packaging of our product and sending it to us. So I have this just a little bit, I have it on the straight line going across. I always press my fabric down and I check it to make sure that it's equally level on that line all the way across my fabric. Because if one side is up past the line more than this side, as I go through, I'm going to get unequal cuts. We don't want that to happen. So now that I have that done, over here, I have my fabric just a little bit past my line that I'm going to be using to create my straight edge. And I'm going to use that line as my guide and line up my ruler from end to end. Now, I'm sure that you've noticed in cutting, whenever you move the bottom of your ruler, the top moves and doesn't stay in place. So once I get the top where I need it, I hold it down tightly and I just shift the bottom part of my ruler so it lines up equally the same as the top of my ruler. And you want to make sure that you're holding your fingers sort of in a spider form away from your ruler as you cut. You don't want to be cutting your fingers. That's never fun. And you want your fingers to be somewhat close to the area that you're going to be cutting so that it stays straight. This ruler slips a little bit on me when I'm cutting. So I put a little hand weight on the end to hold my ruler so it's not shifting as I'm cutting and my rotary blade is up against my ruler. Sometimes that will cause your ruler to shift side to side. And I don't want to find out when I get up here that my ruler has moved over and now I won't have my straight cut. So that just helps me to keep my ruler in place. I have a new one of these coming in soon, of the Creative Grids, which I love Creative Grid rulers because they have multiple areas where they have the grip so it doesn't slide as much. This one doesn't have that, so I have to be extra protective when I'm cutting. So I'm going to make my straight edge, and so I'm going to cut. I can feel that I didn't get, there we go. So I'm going to hold my rotary cutter right there while I move my fingers up so that they're closer to the area where I'm going to be cutting, and I'm going to be keeping my ruler in a nice steady position when I cut. And I'll finish my cut. So we know that our first square was 6.5 by 6.5. This square is my first accent piece that's going to be going around that square. This one needs to be cut 7 1/4. Now I always recommend that when you're first doing your first block and you're practicing, use scraps or use some muslin to practice with. That way, if you make mistakes and you're in a learning phase, you don't have to worry about ruining fabric. Also, it gives us a chance to see how our colors are going to match up to each other and so forth. And I just like to use scraps usually when I'm first making a new block that I've never made before. If you've done these before, you probably don't need to do that. But if this is a new block to you, I recommend using scraps. This is a skill building exercise, making this quilt. So each block presents a little bit different skills and so forth. This ruler is large and I love it. I'm not going to be able to get the entire ruler probably into the camera for you, but the size of this ruler is 12.5 by 24.5. And I love this because I'm able to get my larger width cuts. Makes it a lot simpler for me. Creative Grids has a lot of wonderful markings. They have all of your markings both in black and in white. And that is so that whatever fabric that you're trying to line up in your ruler, whether it's a dark fabric or a light fabric, you have lines the right color to be able to match it up. That is so helpful. So I know that I need this to be 7 1/4. So I always line up one straight line, one solid straight line on my fold, and then I'm going to match up my 1/4 inch going up. And the reason why I'm showing you this ruler is, one, I love Creative Grids. It has multiple, so all across here are little grippy tabs, and every couple of inches there are grippy tabs going up and down it, and on the edges, all around 1/4 inch on the edges, it has those same grips. And this helps so that your ruler doesn't slide as much, if any at all. And you don't have to put a lot of pressure. So I usually try to get my fingers lined up in an area where I have the grippy dots. These grippy dots are already built into your ruler, so you don't have to go and buy extra dots to add to your ruler. They're already built into it. I always check my measurement twice before I cut. This ensures that I'm not going to mess up and do a wrong cut. Because once you cut your fabric, you can't fix that. So I hold my fingers, like I said, in a spiderish type form, spread out, so I'm getting a good hold. You don't have to put a lot of pressure with these rulers, but you just put some pressure in the areas where it has the grippy dots, somewhat near where you're going to be cutting. And when I'm about at the halfway point, I stop, hold my rotary cutter, and I move my fingers up so that I'm securing my ruler up here. I double check to make sure that nothing funky has happened with my ruler, and then I'll finish my cut. If you can, as the more you cut fabric, the more that you can tell, you can hear. I have more folds. I'm using a 60 millimeter rotary blade cutter so that I can go through more layers easily. But if you hear that you missed an area, which you'll be able to start knowing the more that you cut, you'll hear the difference between hitting your mat with your rotary blade and it not going all the way through. And right about in this area, I could hear that it kind of skipped a little bit. I didn't press the same pressure. Don't ever go back and forth like this. You will create jags on the edge and you won't have a straight cut. But what you can do is go back over your cut, as long as you didn't move your ruler. And now I know I got that. So we're making a 7 1/4 by a 7 1/4 square. Now I know I cut a whole strip. You don't need to cut a whole strip for this. But I'll end up cutting this strip down later as I'm making other blocks. I'll just cut it down, and then I keep whatever scraps get created from the excess in other blocks or borders and so forth. So I'm not too worried about it. If you're using scraps, you could just get a piece that's, 8 inches or whatever and cut it down to what you need it. Now I'm not going to, oh wait a minute, yeah, I only need one of these, so I'm going to open this up so I'm not cutting all of my strip. And once again, I'm going to line it up on a line. And I always press my fabric before cutting because wrinkles will give you uneven cuts. And we don't want uneven cuts. So I'm going to get my straight edge again. I need to cut the selvage off. Make sure that your fabric, when you put your ruler down, doesn't lift up and create like, you know, a pocket there, because then you won't get a straight cut either. So now I'm going to line my ruler up. And cut this selvage off. There we go. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut it 7 1/4 this way, so I get my 7 1/4 square. So I have my solid line on the bottom edge of my fabric, nice and straight, and I've lined up my 1/4 inch, my 7 1/4 inch on this side. I've double checked it so I can go ahead and I can make my cut. And I love this ruler because when I need to do multiple large cuts, it's so much easier. I can get all my larger cuts on this ruler. So I use my regular one that's 6 by 24 1/2 for most of my cutting, a majority of the time. But when I need some larger pieces cut out, this Big Easy ruler is so handy. So now with that 7 1/4 inch square, we're going to make 2 cuts on it, and we want to do that without moving it. So I'm going to put it a little bit slanted for me. You're going to do your first cut diagonally from corner to corner. Don't separate it. Don't move it. Just lift your ruler up after, and then we're going to turn our ruler and we're going to do a cut diagonally in the other direction. So when I'm doing this, I just set my square kind of tilted just a little bit so I'll be able to make both cuts. So I'll be able to lay my ruler this way and then lay my ruler that way without shifting my fabric. And that's going to give me 4 equal-sized triangles. And I just hold my ruler up, lift it up above my fabric as I line up my ruler diagonally. And when I can see it's lined up, I just lay it down. Now for your first cut, it's not going to be a problem if you shift your fabric, but when you do your second cut, you don't want to shift your fabric. So now that I have that lined up diagonally, I can make my cut. Now I'm not going to move my fabric at all. I'm just going to leave it there, and I'm going to line up my ruler going in the other direction. And once I get one side lined up, I'm just going to hold that end of the ruler, and I kind of got to shift my ruler a little bit, but I'm holding it hovered above the fabric as I line it up so I don't shift my fabric. And once I have that lined up, I'll make my second cut. Now I can move them. And just that little piece there didn't quite get cut because of the angle that I'm in. But now I have I got just a little itsy bitsy piece that didn't catch when I went to cut it. So now I have 4 triangles, equal sized. And when we sew these, we'll be sewing these so that they go like this. So we'll have one on each side. And you'll notice that these overhang just approximately, just around about 1/4 of an inch overhang. And when we go to sew them, we're going to sew one to the top, one to the bottom, and once we have those sewed and pressed, then we'll come back and we'll sew one to each side. And that will be our first square in a square. So now we need 2 that are 6 7/8. And this will be our last triangles that go around that square, which will create one large square, 12.5 inches, when we have it all sewn together. And I've already pressed my fabric. And I'm going to create my straight edge. It's almost straight, but it's just a sliver off. And I want to make sure that I have a nice straight edge. So I won't be cutting a lot off, but I will be cutting just a little tiny bit off. So I'm going to line my fabric up, my fold up. I've double checked it to make sure that it's a nice fold. There's no puckering in there. And I'm going to have it just a little bit over my line so that I can get a nice straight edge once I get this lined up. And with this being a larger ruler, it doesn't shift as easily as a smaller ruler does. And especially with the Creative Grids, because it has those nice grips underneath. Okay. So I'm going to make my straight edge on the side here. Okay, so now I know that's straight. I'm going to be cutting 6 7/8. So often people will ask me, how do you get your 7/8 or your 3/8 or whatever? In your ruler, every inch you'll have your quarter markings, your half mark, and your whole inch. These smaller dashes are all an 1/8. So if I was cutting 3/8, I would check my solid line, and then I would count over 1, 2, 3, and that would be my 3/8. I need 7/8, so you just count over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are 8 eighths in an inch. So 7/8 for me, I know, is always 1/8 from the next, inch over. So if I know that I need 6 7/8, I just look to see where my 6 is, and I know it's going to be 1 mark from my 7. And I've got my numbers going because I have my ruler turned in the other direction. But if I'm checking, then I know that it's going to be 1 from that end. So we're going to do 2 squares, 6 7/8. So I'm going to line this up, solid line on the bottom, line up so I'm at the 6 7/8, which is 1/8 before the 7, of course. And I'm just going to make sure I just check my lines going up through to make sure that each line lines up on the edge of my fabric. And that my solid line has stayed straight on my fold. And then I'll go ahead and I'll cut this. Now, if you do run into a piece where you didn't cut it completely, you can come over with your scissors and get that little, sometimes it skips over a tiny piece, and you just want to make sure that that stayed straight. I'm still getting used to my new rotary cutter and learning how much pressure I need to put down for my cuts. Okay, so I have 6 7/8. And now I need to get my straight cut to remove my selvage on the end. Okay, so I know I'm going to need 2, so I'm going to leave this folded. And I'll line my ruler up again so I'm at 6 7/8. I'll get that solid line so it's nice across the bottom. And get this lined up so that each one of my dashes that show my 6 7/8 is lined up well. And then I double check my solid line on the bottom and make sure that that's lined up well. Now they do have a ruler tape that you can put. So if you knew that you were going to be doing a lot of cuts for the 6 7/8, you could put a piece of tape down just a little bit before the 7/8, not on the 7/8, or 6 7/8 rather, but just a little bit after it, because you always want to use your ruler for your markings, not anything else. Tape will usually not go down perfectly straight for you. So I put it just a little bit past my markings so that my eyes, whenever I have to come back and do that cut. So if I was going to be cutting, say, 10, 15, 20 of these cuts, I would put some of this tape down so that I can just quickly focus and find where I'm going to be focusing my eyes. You could also use painter's tape for that, because painter's tape removes pretty darn easily. And, you know, it sticks, but it doesn't overstick to your item. And like I said, I always put it just a little bit past the marking that I'm trying to focus my eyes on. And it just helps my eyes to focus where I'm going to be doing my cut. Since I'm only doing one of these cuts, I'm not going to bother with the tape, but if I was to need to do a lot of them, I would. And when I've made a cut, I never move my ruler or the fabric underneath. I'll just easily move the fabric next to it, because if I've not completely gotten a cut, it's easy to get it before I've moved all my fabric. Okay, so with this one, we have 6 7/8 square. I'm going to cut these diagonally in half. So I'm just going to line up my ruler from corner to corner diagonally. And when you're cutting diagonally from corner to corner, if you put your ruler exactly on that corner, you're going to end up cutting a little bit past your corner. So I get really super close to my corner with my ruler, but remembering that I'm leaving just enough room, you know, just a sliver for when my rotary blade goes through, that I'm going to be cutting on that exact diagonal. So now I will end up with 4 larger triangles, which will be going around the outside of my square in a square, like so. So let's head on over to the sewing machine, and we're going to put these together. Well, before we head over to the sewing machine, the one thing that I want to point out, I always use a mat smoother, which are available from Seaside Quilting Supplies. I always use a mat smoother on my mat after I've made cuts in the area that I've cut. You don't want to swish it around in circles or, you know, this way, that way. I just, not pressing hard, I just go over the areas where I've cut to remove any fibers. And I feel with my fingers, and I'm just getting off any fibers that I've left in a cut, because if you just walk away and leave them as your mat is trying to heal itself back from your cut, depending on how heavy-handed you are when you cut, I'm trying to learn not to press as hard, but to give myself enough pressure so I'm cutting through all my fabric. And I'm learning the balance with my new rotary cutter, which I absolutely love, the Quilters Select rotary cutter, for many reasons, which if you haven't seen my review on that, go ahead and check that out. But by using your mat smoother, you get those fibers out, and now your mat is able to heal properly. And every so often you want to clean your mat, not with any heavy chemicals or anything. You can just spritz some water and vinegar on it and take a cloth and clean it. It keeps it conditioned and moistened. You don't want your mat to dry out and get hard on you, because then your cuts don't come out right either. So anyways, let's head over to the sewing machine and get our block going. I know sometimes when I'm teaching a block or a project, I probably give you a little extra information, more than what maybe some of you need. But I always try to keep in mind that we have new sewers, we have new quilters with us that haven't done all of this before. And when I started out, I was learning on my own. I didn't have anyone around that knew all of the different things to teach me. I was learning from books and watching shows on PBS. And sometimes people don't give you all those extra tips, and we don't learn them until much later when we've developed bad habits. And I think that when we learn to do something, we should learn the good habits to go with whatever we're doing, so that we start with good habits, not start with bad habits and then have to change them later. Because once you've done something in a different way for a long time, it's hard to change what we do. So I try to teach in a way that you learn more from the beginning to help you. But if at any time I'm teaching you something that you feel is too repetitive for you, you've heard me say it too many times, that's the nice thing about a tutorial that's a video, because you can just skip ahead. You can go, oh, I've heard Terry say that way too many times now. I don't need to hear that. You can skip ahead to the fun part. So what we're going to do first is we're going to sew one of our first accent triangles to one side, and then to the top, and then to the bottom. And you're going to see that they're going to overhang approximately about 1/4 of an inch, I think it is. Maybe just a little bit more. Actually, probably about 3/8 over. Yeah, about 3/8 pass on each end when we sew them. So we're just going to line it up, and you're going to fold it over right side to right side. Now you don't have to be perfectly exact. Another thing that you could do is you could do a line, finding your center, going in both directions, and make a chalk line so that you could line up your triangle point. So let's go ahead and look at doing that. Let me find a ruler that is long enough. Okay, so I have a 6.5 inch ruler. So I'm going to need, my center will be 3 1/4. And I'm just going to make a chalk line there so that I know where my center is there. And then I'll put my ruler over going in the other direction. And mark 3 1/4 this way. I should have just drawn my line all the way across, mind you. And then you can, and I'm just using chalk because this is a dark fabric and I want it to show up. And chalk just wipes away super easy. Let me get that up there so it's squared up. And we just need that center marking. So now, when I put my triangle and line it up, I'm going to check that my point of my triangle is on my line. Now, it doesn't have to be 100% perfect, but if we're trying to square these up and make them look so that they line up all well, it's nice to do this line on your center block and see that your point is on the line. And now I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch all the way from one edge to the other edge. Now we do have this overhang, but just make sure that you start just a little bit before your square so that you're getting completely from edge to edge. Now I'm using my 1/4 inch guide foot. If you're using a straight foot, that's fine. Just stay on your 1/4 inch line so that you know that you're getting your 1/4 inch. And I'm doing my stitches at 2.0 so I get a nice seam on here that holds up well. I'm using 50 weight Aurifil thread. And I'm using that in the top, and I'm using that in my bottom. Now sometimes on a quilt, I'll use bottom line thread, which is 60 weight. That's totally fine. Whichever your preference is. But whatever you start a quilt with, you want to continue a quilt with all the way through, so that you're staying consistent with your blocks and so that they'll come out the same size. So you'll see, hopefully you can see, I started just a little bit past my square because I have this dog ear that's sticking out on the edge, so I could start just a little bit before it, and I sewed a little bit past it because we're going to be cutting these dog ears off. Before I do that, I'm going to press it. So I like to set my stitches before I fold it open. Remember, don't iron back and forth, just press. And once I've set my stitches, or my seam, now we're going to be pressing this towards the dark side most typically. Both of my fabrics are fairly, one's a medium, one's a dark. I'm going to have all of my seams going toward my triangles, so that if I was to fold them all inward on my square, I'm going to get bulk in my corners. So I'm going to fold it out so that the seam will be toward my triangle. And I'm just going to run my fingernails, or your fingers, whichever you prefer, up against that seam so that when I fold it over, I don't have my seam rolling too much over. I want a nice straight seam. So I'll finger press that, not pressing hard, not stretching my fabric. And then I'm going to press that in place. And so now I have that out of the way for my next block. And also, by using chalk, I didn't lose my line. If I would have used a Frixion pen, I would have lost my line because the heat would have gotten rid of it. And while I'm right here, I'm going to trim my dog ears off. Right up against my square. We don't need those in there creating bulk. If we have extra bulk, sometimes that sets off our measurement. Okay, so now we're going to do our next triangle, and we're going to do that the same way And we're going to do that on the bottom, and we're going to line it up so that our triangle point is right on the line, and that our raw edges at the end where we're going to be sewing are lined up really well, and our point is lined up well. And go ahead and sew your 1/4 of an inch from edge to edge on this one. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to press and set our seam. Fold it open, give it a finger press, and then we'll press it again. And I like to use my quilter's clapper because it gets my seams nice and flat. And the flatter my seams, the better my measurement will be at the end. And once again, you'll go ahead and you'll trim your dog ears on each side. Now you're going to do the same thing. You'll take your other triangles and you're going to line up, do your first side, and then after you've done that side, press, trim, your dog ears. When you go to do your dog ears, we'll take a look at that after we've done this side. So go ahead and do this side, sewing edge to edge. There we go. I got that lined up. Make sure that your triangle lines up with your line, and go ahead and do your 1/4 inch seam all the way. Okay, so when I sewed all the way from the edge all the way to the other edge. Just so that you can see, I've sewed completely across. Now when we put our first ones down, we were just concerned about getting from the edge of our square to the edge of our square. But now we wanted to make sure that we went completely from the edge of our fabric all the way to the other edge of our fabric. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to press and set our seam. Fold it open and give it a finger press. And then we'll go ahead and press that open, and then we're going to put our quilter's clapper on there to get that nice and flat. Now you'll see that your piece folds over each edge. Our triangle did line up. The center of our triangle lined up with our line. So don't worry about what your edges. But we will trim off the dog ears going in a diagonal. And we'll do that on each side of it. And now, you're going to go ahead and you're going to do your last triangle on the top. The same exact way. Okay, so now what we have created is a square and a square. So if you look at it this way, you can see your outer square. And then if you turn it this way, which would be on point, you have your square inside and your square outside, but it's set on point. which sometimes, and you'll see later on, as you're doing more and more quilts, some blocks are set so, and they'll say set it, you know, it's set on point. And that's because you have this going in a diagonal. Okay. So now we're going to do the same exact thing, except that when we line up on the edge, you'll notice, well, we don't have a line now to put that up against. So what you can do is you can do your lines diagonally across so that you have that guide. Or you can square up your, you know, line up your raw edges and then just see that your point is equally between your other two lines. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to mark my lines. I'm going to need a little bit of a longer ruler to do that because we're going on the diagonal. So you can go ahead and you can draw your line diagonally that way, and your line diagonally this way. And then you'll line up your raw edges just as we did before, and now you have your line going diagonally to match up your point of your triangle. I'm just double checking that my raw edges are up where they need to be. And you might, at this point, since we're using, you know, a little bit of a larger piece, once you have it lined up, go ahead and put some clips or some pins on there to keep your fabric in place, raw edge to raw edge, so that as you're sewing it stays nice and straight, double checking that your point is up against your line. So you're going to go ahead and you're going to sew one this side, press it open, trim your dog ears, and then you'll put your bottom one on and do the same. Okay, so my thread caught up underneath there. There we go. Once again, I'm going to set my seam, finger press this open, and I'm going to have my seams once again going toward my triangle so I can keep the bulk from ending up all in there. And it will just make it a nice, smoother, flatter square. And the way that I've set mine up also, I have my darkest piece in the center, and then my accent pieces are a medium, and I'm considering this to be a light piece just because it has the white in it, but it has all the shades of the fabric that I'm using previously. Now you can do it any way that you want. Choose your colors however you want. You could have a light piece in the middle, and then have a darker accent around that, and then go to a medium. However you want to set up your fabric so that they accent each other and flow well together. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to press this open. I really do need to get the larger quilter's clapper for these, because it will be easier to set my seams. This is nice for small blocks, but I need to get the larger one at some point. I'll have to add that to my budget. So, you want to go ahead and trim your dog ears off on each edge, just as you did previously. And when I make my trim, I'm lining it up with my squared piece. So go ahead and do the very opposite side, or what I would call the bottom, and just line it up the same way, so edge to edge, and do your pressing and clip your dog ears. Okay, so now we're going to do our last two triangles, and you're going to do the same thing as we did before. Line up your raw edges, line up the point of your triangle with your line. I'm going to put a couple clips on here just to keep my fabric lined up nicely. I always check the back to make sure that the back is lined up. I can't tell you how many times I used to sew and then I'd look and then my back was not as lined up as I thought it was. And then I had to take it apart and fix it. And nobody likes having to get that seam ripper out, so it's good to do all your double checking before you sew. So go ahead and sew this. Once again, make sure that you go all the way from the edge of your fabric all the way over to the end, to the edge of your fabric over here, so that you're getting past your square edge with your sewing. So you want a complete 1/4 inch all the way. So one of the things that I wanted to point out was that when we did our second triangles going around our square, at the diagonal, our pieces crossed over each other. But when we put our next triangles on, see how it comes up and it's covering where it crossed, and now we have a point here rather than, and you don't see the fabrics crossing over each other. And the same on the sides. It's covering it up, and so we have points on each end. And having those lines drawn, I know it's like a little bit of an extra step, but it gives us a way to line up the points of our triangles, which gives us our nice points in our center by lining those all up. So go ahead and do your last piece. And just remember, line up the point of your triangle with your line, and sew your 1/4 inch. And that will be our last piece that we need to sew on. So then when we're all done, we have our economy block all finished, which will look like a square in a square in a square. And what we're trying to achieve is to get nice points on each of our squares. So looking at it from this direction, you want to have a nice point. You don't want this to overlap too far and come over to the, to the darker blue. You want these pieces to be right on the edge, your inner pieces, your inner pieces. But when you do your outer pieces, you want them to come right to the edge, so you're making your point, but not overlapping it. Sometimes when we're sewing, you need to remember to hold your fabric with both hands as you're sewing through so that your line stays nice and straight. If it wavers, like say you get to here and when you hit a seam, you wave a little bit, this would not come out to a nice point. You would see more of the blue sticking out and you wouldn't have that nice point. If that happens to you, just take your seam ripper and take this out. I'll press this piece so that it's nice and flat again, and then just re-sew it and slow down. You can slow your machine down and to get a nice straight line, which gives you your nice points. And also you'll want this to be a nice point on this side so that when you sew your other blocks to it, it will show up a nice point on each of your sides. So this was our economy block. I hope that you've enjoyed the lesson. If you have a moment, please take and like the video and subscribe to Seaside Quilting Supplies. And there's a little bell right next to the subscribe button. If you click on that, you can change it to all. And each time that we have a new one of our blocks come out for our sampler block quilt, there's going to be 12 blocks. We're on block number 8. So we have 4 more blocks to go. We'll be finishing up the end of June. Our last block will come out mid-June, actually. And then we'll be giving you some ideas on how to put your blocks together and whatnot, squaring them up, all that kind of stuff. So I hope that this has been helpful. Just as a reminder, Seaside Quilting Supplies does a live on Facebook every Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And we have sales on that day, sometimes on fabrics that have been around for a while. We'll put sales on them. We have notions that we show during that time. We vary it each Thursday to change it up and make it a little bit different. And sometimes there's thread, sometimes there's other rulers, many other notions, interfacing, so forth, that we show on Thursdays. Every other Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, we have a live fabric event where you can purchase, in both the lives on Facebook, you can purchase the items as we're showing them or send in orders afterward. So this is one of our Sundays. This will be posting after our sale, actually, but every other Sunday, and you can always check on Facebook on Seaside Quilting Supplies LLC is the business page. Check on there. We always keep a calendar up so that you can see the dates and the times of our live events. And every once in a while we have pop-up sales and so forth. So I hope that you'll join us over there, and happy sewing!